I'm the president of Bitterrooters for Planning, who is sponsoring this public talk. Bitterrooters for Planning is a nonprofit public interest organization that seeks wise and balanced consideration for decisions affecting the public's interest on a wide scope. In the past, primarily areas of focus have regarded land use, natural resource management, issues like water quality, air quality. And we'd like to articulate, they do recognize that a lot of that focus and concerns of environmental issues and natural resources and planning and management of that. The linkage of environmental justice and social justice is very strong. And so we hopefully will be bringing, over the course of this next year, speakers in the vein of providing, again, some broadened perspective on public interest issues. And we hope to provide some good information and look for some common interests in terms of managing not only the living landscape and stewarding the living landscape that we all truly cherish and value here where we live and in our nation, but also to dialogue in a manner that also stewards the common ground that we share as human beings and the common elements of a focus on stewarding our humanity as well. We're very fortunate tonight to have with us Jack Tuholske, arguably the preeminent environmental lawyer practicing in Montana. Jack Tuholske graduated from the University of Montana Law School in 1985 and continues a private practice based out of Missoula. He primarily emphasizes public interest, environmental litigation in both state and federal court in Montana and the West. Jack has been lead counsel in more than 45 published decisions, including over a dozen successful cases at the Montana Supreme Court level. In fields as diverse as water law, land use, constitutional law, citizen lawsuits, and natural resource management. He successfully represented the Bitterroot River Protective Association before the Supreme Court here in Montana in the Mitchell-Sue case, which established that free-flowing streams in Montana cannot be reclassified as ditches by merely manipulating them, and that the public retains the right to access those streams. Jack has been recognized for his work by the Sierra Club in 2002 with the William Douglas Award, and in 2010 the Kerry Rybert Award from the University of Oregon's Public Interest Law Conference. Most recently now, Jack has also combined teaching with his law practice and holds appointments as a visiting professor at the University of Montana and the Vermont Law School, where he directs the Water and Justice program. As a Fulbright Scholar in 2009, Jack taught at the law faculty of University of Ljubljana in Slovenia. He also is a technical advisor to the Vermont Law School U.S.-Asian Partnership for Environmental Law. Currently, Mr. Thulosche's public interest cases involve protection of endangered fish species, water pollution prevention, and challenging coal development that threatens farms and ranchers. He also serves as lead counsel representing Bitterrooters for Planning in 3 active public interest land use and water pollution prevention lawsuits. One contesting the Legacy Ranch subdivision, decision made by the Valley County Commissioners, and 2 cases challenging the Montana Department of Environmental Quality for their approval of groundwater discharge permits, one for the Grantsdale Addition subdivision, and another for the Blood Lane development projects. It's definitely my privilege and an honor to be able to present to you this evening. Jack Tuholske.
Thanks, Jim. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah, get it closer. The mic closer.
How's that? All right. Thank you for the kind words and the welcome, and it is a pleasure to be here in Hamilton this evening, and with a great turnout here. I thank you all for coming. So I'm going to start. I'm going to start big, and I'm going to work my way down. And I'm probably going to get myself in a little bit of trouble here because I'm a practicing attorney by trade, and I teach environmental law. But in the process of doing that, have been exposed to some really important ideas that I'm trying to get my hands around and tie into what's going on in our world today. So if I get myself in trouble with some of the science, we start talking about economics, you can call me to the carpet on that when we're done. So I'm going to start with a big picture that I think has to inform our understanding of environmental politics on the local level. And then I want to talk about why it is so difficult to advance environmental protection, both in the United States and especially here in Montana. Why is it so hard to do that? And then I want to conclude with some thoughts about moving forward in the 21st century. So it's my opinion that this century and perhaps the last half of the 20th century represent a profound moment in human evolution. I think we are at a crossroads, and it's not an original thought. A lot of people that have looked at this issue in the big picture would agree with that. I want to start with Sir Martin Rees, who is an astrophysicist at Cambridge. And he provides this insight. For 45 million centuries, 45 million centuries, natural processes have controlled the earth. They've controlled the geology, ultimately the development of life and the evolution of life. It has been controlled by natural processes, whether it's sunspots or earth wobbling or volcanoes or earthquakes, all plate tectonics, whatever. That's all natural process. But in the last century, so one out of 45 million centuries, 1 century, maybe 1.5, that is no longer true. One species now predominantly, and I'm not saying that we've stopped plate tectonics, don't get me wrong, but in terms of influencing the condition of our planet, our species exerts a predominant influence on the biological diversity and life and a lot of the natural processes, including our climate, that go with that. That's a profound change in very short order. And so for Sir Martin Rees, he's talking about the humans having control via nuclear war, biotechnology, social media, that the ability for, he believes, kids in the year 2100, like when we were kids and we had chemistry sets, what would I do? I'd go make bombs, right? Or maybe some green and purple goo that I'd dump in my mom's sink and she'd get really pissed off. Well, in the 21st century, he believes that kids will be able to develop life forms. That our technology is accelerating and it's that far advanced. And certainly, we can alter genes now. We can create new life forms. Not for the past 45 million centuries has one species been able to do that, and yet now we can. And that is a profound change in how the world is shaped. And he doesn't even talk about climate change. Okay, we'll get to that later. But he's obviously aware of it. So the second person who I admire trying to come to understand this is E.O. Wilson, the great biologist at Harvard. And he has written for many years about the impending biodiversity crisis. And he writes very persuasively and has coined an acronym HIPPO, H-I-P-P-O, HIPPO, as being the threat to life on Earth. HIPPO. Habitat destruction, invasives, pollution, population of humans, and overharvesting. Working in concert might eradicate 50% of the species on Earth by the year 2100. The sixth extinction, we've all heard about it. Happening, you know, the other extinctions, even when, you know, the comet or the asteroid might have popped down and messed things up. You know, the extinction didn't happen in 25 or 50 or 100 or 150 years. Often took centuries or millennium or millions of years for these great extinctions. And now we might be manufacturing one from hippo, human influence, Homo sapien created, you know, in a couple hundred years. Half the species might be gone by 2100. So that, you know, that's not natural forces at work. That's one species, Homo sapiens. Wilson says half major species likely extinct by 2100. You know, whether you want to call it the Anthropocene or the end of the Holocene, things are radically different. In this century, sure, you know, 10,000 years ago, we were starting to muck things up a little bit, right? You know, we might have done in the saber-toothed tiger, we did in the dodo bird. I mean, we humans have had an effect on the planet for a long time. You know, I'm not saying that. But, you know, even in 1804, when we finally hit 1 billion people, 1804, that's when we finally hit 1 billion. I mean, you know, this country was largely unpopulated, and natural forces were, you know, predominantly controlling what was going on. And that's not true anymore today. It just isn't true. And we've gone from 1 billion in 1804. I mean, you know, we broke out of Africa 60,000 years ago as a species, and we spread. Well, you know, elephants didn't make it to 6 of the 7 continents. You know, chimpanzees didn't figure out how to do that, but we did. We did it pretty quickly, but even then, you know, 60,000 years, it's a drop in the bucket, but, you know, for most of that time, the Earth kind of functioned okay. Even after we developed agriculture, all that stuff, you know, the Amazon was there, you know, the prairie was there. There were 60 million bison when Lewis and Clark were, you know, working their way across the continent. In a microsecond, all that has changed by one species, by Homo sapiens. And now we are faced with a, you know, as I said, I think we are truly at a crossroads. And, you know, it's important to keep that in perspective when we're going to try to drill down and understand, well, if everything's so bad, you know, how come everyone hates me when I'm trying to do something that I think is good? I mean, I think that's a question we need to try to come to understand. Because environmental protection is hard. It's difficult. We're villainized. We're marginalized, and we're often ineffective. Even while in the big picture, these things are happening. These are scientific realities. They are happening. And as I said, you know, the human population curve, and that's one of Wilson's, you know, 5 causes of the biodiversity crisis that we're creating. You know, human population, you really got to think about that. I mean, 1804, 1 billion, I think 1927, 2 billion, 7 today, 9 by 2050, where's it going to go? That's a lot of Homo sapiens. You know, we are the dominant life force on Earth now, except the ants have the understory, and that's what Wilson really likes to study. And he's got a fascinating explanation, and it's theory, and it's over my head, so I'm not even going to try to explain it, as to why ants and termites own the soil under there, and why Homo sapiens really have evolved as the only truly social species, and that's how we've come to dominate the surface. But as I said, this perspective I think is important. I mean, these are abstract ideas, and they're interesting to read about, and, you know, I'm not losing any sleep over it, and I doubt that any of you are. You probably know a lot of this stuff. You've heard bits and pieces of it. But I think that it's important to keep things in perspective, because I do think that there is an element of urgency. Not urgency tomorrow, but that this is a crossroads. The 21st century, I think, is a crossroads. And so if, you know, and like I said, I have not even talked about climate change, and I'm not going to make a speech on climate change tonight, and I don't want to have a debate about it, but it's real. It is going to cause profound changes, not only to our species, but pretty much every other living thing too. And all of the evidence that we see shows that it is not going away. CO2 emissions continue to rise. So we are at a crossroads, and that's another huge piece of the crossroads in the 21st century, whether we're going to get a handle on that, as well as the other things that Martin Rees talked about, the ability to create life, to alter genes. You know, he said, you know, if it can be done, someone will do it. And there's always bad actors out there. We've got to get a handle on those things. Hippo, habitat destruction, invasive, overharvesting, population, all those things, they're heading us in a direction. And we need to understand that and keep that perspective and have it inform what we're trying to do here today. So that leads me to my second pertinent question, and I'm going to probably talk here for 45 minutes at the most, and then would invite a conversation and discussion, questions from the audience. But the second thing that I want to talk about here tonight is, okay, with all that going on, you would think that, man, I could be president, right? We need a green president. You know, someone that's going to deal. I mean, because, yeah, we want jobs, you know, and I really want my kid to win the soccer game. I want my car to start in the morning. When I turn on the light, no, not turn on the light, when I plug in my computer and my iPhone and my iPad and my coffee maker, I want some juice there, right? You know, I mean, I'm not denying those things. But still, if this problem is so pervasive and so serious, and really we're at this crossroads, why is it so darn hard to do something about it? And that's a question that I am spending a considerable amount of time trying to figure out, and I don't have any clear answers, and there are a lot of other really smart people out there taking a look at this. But we can certainly start to talk about it. And again, some of this is probably things that you know about. And here's something that's not a surprise. It's hard to be an environmentalist in the Bitterroot Valley, right? Well, in other places in the world, you know, environmentalists get killed, they get thrown in jail. I mean, it's really hard to be an environmentalist in a lot of parts of the world. And why is that so? Okay, I'm going to say it. Don't blame the Republicans. I'm serious. Don't blame the Republicans. Or at least the Republicans that I know and love. And I gotta go back to Teddy Roosevelt, and if we're going to talk about environmentalism in this country, he is one of the greats. An ethos of service, I think, that is unmatched. You know, born into wealth. Sure, he liked to shoot things and put them on his wall and all that. Product of his times, but you know, one of the great environmentalists and a Republican. And he hated pure market capitalism. He hated it. And he believed in the public trust, public lands, public water. Incredible values. And he was a Republican. And then we cannot talk about environmental law and politics without talking about the greatest environmentalist in the 20th century. And some of you know the punchline here. Richard Nixon, right? Well, it's a true fact. Maybe not wittingly, but in the history books, you know, the 1970s, come on. NEPA, the ESA, the Clean Water Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, RCRA. I mean, what's that?
Clean air.
Clean air, thank you. Probably a couple of more out there. Wild Scenic Rivers Act, 1968. I mean, this is an incredible legacy. An incredible legacy from that time period. And it was put into law by a Republican, signed into law. I mean, we can talk about other things. We can talk about bipartisanism, about a government that, you know, at least sort of tried to function. Might have been tape recording some people on the side, but, you know. But you cannot deny the 1970s, and you cannot deny that it was, many of these laws were bipartisan efforts. They were Republican, they were Democrat, and they were signed into law by Richard Nixon. He has that legacy. So, don't blame the Republicans. And now I want to drill down a little bit and talk about Montana, because what was going on nationally was reflected in this state. And I know many of you in this room were around for that. Some of you probably had a hand in it. Predated my arrival. But, you know, in the early 1970s, Montana was the most progressive environmental state in the country, in my opinion. The most progressive. Montana Environmental Policy Act, one of the very first state acts, whole cloth from NEPA. They took NEPA a year or two after it was passed and said, we're going to make it NEPA, a Montana Environmental Policy Act. A very far-sighted major facility siting act. Okay, we're going to have coal, we're going to have mining in this state, we know that, but let's set the bar really high before we have those major developments occur. You know, let's have a rigorous process with public review. Another visionary law. And then, you know, the grandmother of them all, the 1972 Montana Constitution, which, in my opinion, remains one of the most important legal documents in the world. I believe that. In addition to a right to a clean and healthful environment, which is only shared by a handful of other states and by a handful of other countries, and that actually has meaning. I mean, you know, a lot of countries have environmental rights in their constitution, but they don't pay any attention to them. But we have that. You know, a right to privacy. You know, a right to inspect government documents, a right to open meetings. A whole bunch of really visionary things, and it's still on the books, that Constitution. That was another product of the 1970s. So we have this trend going on nationally. It's reflected in Montana. It was okay to be an environmentalist in the 1970s. In fact, you know, might have even gotten a pat on the back if you helped pass the Clean Water Act or the Clean Air Act, or if you were at the Constitutional Convention and you were speaking out like so many did in favor of strong environmental protection. Judge C.B. O'Neill, a very conservative man, passionately speaking about his parents growing up in Anaconda and being subjected to pollution, and continued to voice the intent of the Montana delegates to create a fundamental right to a clean and healthful environment so that our grandchildren didn't have to experience what his parents experienced growing up. So this is all part of our culture. This is all part of our legacy. And so you would think, okay, well then it's really easy to be an environmentalist, right? Because we have this great history. We have this wonderful legacy, and we should just be continuing it. But something's happened, right? Excuse me for a second. Something happened. And I'm going to try to explain my understanding of what happened. Because, you know, it began, I think, in Montana with environmentalists being blamed for the demise of the timber industry. Even though, I'm going to take a look at the price of softwood coming in from Canada. If you want to take a look at mismanagement of timber mills, or a mill, perhaps, in the Bitterroot Valley. If you want to take a look at the fact that the government was subsidizing federal timber cutting. Yeah. But environmentalists took the heat for that in Montana, and they began taking the heat for a lot of things nationwide. Ronald Reagan is elected in 1980, and the rollback begins. And so we have the sea change, the Sagebrush Rebellion. Congress hasn't passed a profound environmental law in a long time. Things have changed on a national level, and on a state level, we have seen a rollback. NEPA, believe me, is nothing what it was intended to be. It is nearly a worthless statute because it has been gutted so many times. Major Facility Siting Act, same thing. The legislature once, about 10 years ago, I remember being in Helena, we had to go testify on this. They actually tried to pass a statute interpreting the Constitution. Well, I'll tell you, in a high school civics class, you learned that the legislature can't amend or interpret a constitution. that you have to go through a constitutional process, and, you know, ever since Marbury versus Madison, only the courts are the final arbiter of the law, but that didn't stop the legislature for wanting to pass a law nullifying the Constitution. You know, go figure on that. But, you know, so we've had this rollback, but it's gotten much worse. It's gotten much worse. It has gotten, in some circles, to, I think, a level of what I would call delusional paranoia about environmentalists. I mean, you know, and I'll get to some of the root causes of this in a minute, but I pulled just a couple of quotes out of my little bag of quotes on this subject. In January 2012, the Republican National Committee passed a resolution that said, the United Nations Agenda 21 plan of radical so-called sustainable development, as if there's something wrong with having some soil left in your field 100 years, and, you know, that's what sustainable development is. This so-called sustainable development views the American way of life of private property ownership, single-family homes, private car ownership, and individual travel choices and privately owned farms, all as destructive to the environment, and sets up this, this zero-sum game. You know, either the American way of life or environmental protection. You know, that's where we've come in 2012. And, you know, when I say delusional, here's another quote, again talking about this Agenda 21, you know, this United Nations plot, and this is a quote from a woman in Virginia who was to sustained applause, says, "They get you hooked." And then Agenda 21 takes over. The environmentalists get you hooked. You know, and I'm saying, I am an addict. Clean air, I'm stuck on it. Clean water, man, yeah, I can't live without it. Sorry, I'm hooked. But no, she's not talking about that. She's talking about smart meter devices being installed by utility companies to collect information on energy uses, part of the conspiracy. The real job of smart meters is to spy on you and control you, so you can't use your electrical appliances. Oh my God, I can't plug in the toaster. It's your fault, you environmentalists. Working in concert, of course, with the United Nations, and I know you all have in your cell phone the speed dial right into the UN. Anyway, yeah. So, I mean, we have gone from, you know, like the Sagebrush Rebellion, and, you know, sort of, you know, Reagan anti-environmentalism, and back in Montana in the 80s and the 90s, you know, the sort of gradual rollback to what I really call, you know, in its worst form, it's just delusional. It is so far removed from reality. But that is part of the reality that we have to face as environmentalists. So why did this happen? Why did this happen? Well, a lot of people have written about this, and I don't think we have all the answers, and it's complicated, you know, more complicated than we can talk about in 20 minutes, but there are some aspects of it that I think are pretty important. And the first thing to understand is that we have this thread in our history, there's no doubt about it, of anti-government. I mean, for goodness sakes, that's how the country was born, right? It is American to be anti-government. Anti-oppressive government. Anti-against the king, but it filters out into anti-government. And that's just, you know, that's just part of our composition. We're not going to undo that, I'm not suggesting, but it can be tapped very easily. We have this ethos or mythos of rugged individualism that pervades our society, and that can be tapped. Anti-government, rugged individualism, because, you know, environmentalism can be painted as being antithetical to all those things, whether it is or not. And finally, we have a pretty large streak of xenophobia running in us, and that's why you know, when we can link environmentalism with the United Nations or with, you know, Europeans, then it can start to resonate. So we have these things that can be tapped. They aren't always tapped. I mean, you know, Teddy Roosevelt and the progressives, Franklin Roosevelt, you know, ran a country and was able to tap into other aspects of our American psyche. You know, our willingness for self-sacrifice, our willingness to work together. You know, our love of our freedom, not only for ourselves, but for our children. these are all different threads, but the three that I just enumerated have been tapped into consistently for the last 50 years, I think, to create an anti-environmental climate. And so, let me give you two pieces of it. One is that we have had a fundamental change in the dominant economic ideology. Free market capitalism is not inherently correct. And it hasn't been the way that our government and markets and economies have functioned since time immemorial. That's not true. You go back and look at Keynesian economics, you look at the New Deal, it can be structured differently. But there is a dominant free market ideology, an absolute belief in free markets that really arose, started in the 50s. Milton Friedman, brilliant man, Nobel laureate, and others at the Chicago School began writing very persuasively, and you tap in automatically to individualism, to anti-government when you talk about the free market, not just as an economic concept, but as an absolute rigid ideology. Get the government out. And the result of that is that what had been a traditional social contract between business and workers, this country prospered actually pretty well with the government and unions and providing pensions for people and those sorts of things, But that disappeared as free market ideology took hold. And, Milton Friedman said in 1970, in an essay called The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase Profits, he said that corporations should not promote desirable social ends, that free market capitalism doesn't do that. He said it's too subversive to have corporations with a conscience. All they should be doing is making profits. And I'm not saying these are bad people, but they just had a strong belief system, and it was captured because it could tap in to prevailing modes of thinking at the time. And related to that, in the 1950s, is this virulent rise of anti-communism. And we all know that, McCarthy era, that's our history book. It started out maybe well-founded, and by the time we got into the 60s and the 70s, there really was no world domination scheme for communism, but we kept acting like it. But even that boogeyman began to fade. And in 1992, George Will said, "Environmentalism is a green tree with red roots." A green tree with red roots. And so the legions of anti-communists needed a new boogeyman, and they put their finger on the environmentalists. And it wasn't hard to paint environmentalism and pro-government regulation, and the next thing you know, we're socialists, and they're going to take your private property away from you if you pass a zoning law. That's government regulation. And so green is the new red. And that, I think, is another aspect that contributes to this current environment of anti-environmentalism. A shift in the economic paradigm and economic philosophy, and we could shift back the other way. In fact, if you look at what happened, in 2008, when the country was pretty darn close to going down a road we didn't want to go down, environmentalists didn't, send Morgan than Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers into bankruptcy, I can assure you of that. And the government then came in and said, GM and AIG and these other massive institutions are too big to fail. Government is meddling in this free market, and it still does. But the mythology of free market economics has really dominated the conversation. There's a book that, if you haven't read it, I'll just mention it here. It's called The Merchants of Doubt by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway. And they do a very convincing job of tracing the rise, and it's really, a fairly small number of people who started out as anti-communists, and when they when they sort of ran out of communists to hate, they switched to, first it was tobacco, and then it was Star Wars, and then it was the ozone hole, and then it was climate change. And these were all things that were going to destroy the American way of life if we tried to do something about them. And so they had a plan, and the plan, it was brilliant. They said, well, what we need to do is to fund organizations, to do research and think tanks and all that to support this notion that green is the new red, that free markets are the only way a free society can live. And so we get the Cato Institute and the Heritage Foundation, and there's legitimate scholarship going on there. People are trying to take a look at what's going on. But lately that has spun off into organizations that I think, frankly, have a more sinister purpose. But what it has led to is a very well-organized opposition. And that's my second point as to why environmentalism is so difficult, is that the opposition is extremely well-organized. And the third point is that they're now, and this really relates to the other two, is that there's unbridled money flowing into these organizations. A study by Professor Brule at Drexel University said that, just quoting, I haven't verified this, but it's a published peer-reviewed study. He said that between 2003 and 2010, $558 million of dark money flowed into organizations that were grinding out anti-climate change, grinding out an agenda. And we often point the finger, and you can, ExxonMobil, they'll spend 20 or 30 million dollars, which is about 13 seconds of their, profit. They'll spend some money on climate change, denying it. Though that has tapered off dramatically. Now if you go on ExxonMobil's website, they actually have a strong position in favor of putting a price on carbon. Whether that's genuine or greenwash, I think it's open to debate, but it's up there on their website. They support a price on carbon. So mainstream big companies, I think, are coming to grips with climate change, but at the same time, there is a huge funding stream heading towards deniers. And that's same funding stream is funding other anti-environmental organizations. $558 million in the span of about 7 years. That's serious money. And it's in terms of, this is my own personal view, in terms of propagating a climate denial machine, they are really just lying to people. You can debate the details of climate change, but I mean, for goodness sakes, the United States Department of Defense, the U.S. Navy, Mitt Romney, I mean, we could go on and on. This is, and virtually the entire scientific community, and yet believes that climate change is human caused. The details and depths and all that will be studied and regurgitated for years to come until we get a better handle on it, but it's real. And yet, $500 million has been raised, dark money, we don't know who it is, and funneled into organizations to prop out propaganda and spend 30 seconds on the web. It is all over the place, and it's just not true. It is just not true. It is pure propaganda. But the dark money thing and the anti-environmentalism, I'm sorry, but it's getting worse. There was a story in the New York Times yesterday. The Koch brothers have hosted a little gathering for folks in Palm Springs. I don't suspect any of you got an invitation. But apparently, this is in the New York Times, they have pledged $860 million to further their causes, which include climate denial and anti-environmentalism and promotion of free market economics and some other things. They have now become, in some experts' opinion, a third political party. They are funding at the level of the entire Republican Party and the entire Democratic Party. They're big players, we know that. But the difference is that, in theory, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party are accountable to their members, their people. You can show up at a party meeting and get elected to a local position within the party, and at least in theory. But you can't do that in the Koch brothers party. And this money, again, gets dispensed. We don't know who the donors are, how big the checks are. You know, they've announced this figure, but it's dark money. It's money that is not traceable. It's people aren't accountable to it. And so, you know, the sky eventually is, I think, is the limit in terms of funding an anti-environmental agenda. And so, is it hard to be an environmentalist in 2015? Yes, it is. And we're beginning to understand some of the reasons why. One other thing I want to mention is judicial races. For the first time, money is flowing into judicial races. You know, the campaign cap is $200, I think, in Montana. Because judge races are supposed to be nonpartisan, we're supposed to just elect them, you know, on their integrity. And that's how it has been for a long time. And that is rapidly changing now. We're spending millions of dollars on judicial races. They are become highly partisan. And again, you know, and both sides, everyone, you know, uses dark money now to elect judges. And that's, for me, a really frightening turn of events. So, you know, are we done? Do we hang it up? Should we just go down to the bar and call it a night? You know, the glass can either be half empty or half full, right? And I believe that it is half full. I do not believe that it is half empty. There is widespread public support for environmental goals. There remains widespread public support for environmental goals. A recent poll by George Mason University, which is a conservative university generally, if you want to characterize it, but you know, a well-respected polling university, said that 56% of registered Republicans and 70% of registered voters support regulating carbon dioxide as a pollutant. 70%, 56% of Republicans. And even more strict regulation, not just regulating CO2 as a pollutant, but regulating it on existing power plants, hugely controversial, passed by Obama, vilified by many. 64% of the total voters, according to George Mason University, including 62% of moderate Republicans, 44% of all Republicans, support strict CO2 emissions on existing power plants. You know, that's significant. You know, that's the antithesis of anti-environmentalism. That's people that are starting to understand, going back to my opening remarks, you know, Houston, we have a problem. A second reason that I think the glass is half full are the millennials. They aren't quite, you know, they're pretty savvy. You know, they're kind of lazy. Like my family. You know, and they're kind of self-entitled, but they don't buy into a lot of the propaganda. They're pretty skeptical and they're really media savvy. A third thing is that, you know, we talked about regulating CO2 as a pollutant. It goes much deeper than that. People hate the the Endangered Species Act, right? I mean, you get a sign and stand out there on the street corner here, Highway 93 tomorrow morning, saying, honk if you love the ESA, okay? I'm not joining you, but you get my point, right? People hate the ESA. They, you know, in part because of this well-funded machine that will find the little old lady in California that couldn't grow her grapes because of some stupid worm or something, right? You know, and that story's probably true, but, you know, we love bald eagles. You know, only because of the Endangered Species Act do we still have them. And in fact, people love endangered species. I mean, how many calendars could you go down to in Barnes and Nobles and buy that are pictures of endangered species? You know, we love wildlife. It is deep within us, and all of us. And it's not limited to party affiliations or ideology. You know, so how do we transform the disconnect between anti-government, anti-individualism, and, you know, what for, I think, many people in some fashion or other is a profound love and respect for nature. But the love is there. The love is there. People love clean water. Clean water polls, you know, off the charts. People hate the Clean Water Act. They hate the idea of regulation. You know, regulation. That's what they associate all this with. So framing is obviously the key. You know, we have to reach more broadly. We have to understand how to appeal across a much wider range of opinions and viewpoints. And we collectively are not doing that because, especially environmental attorneys, we poll at the very bottom of any popularity, below used cars. But the potential is there, and that's why the glass is half full. You know, there is a way to, you know, if 50%, 6% of Republicans are in favor of calling CO2 a pollutant, then I'm thinking we're starting. How can we translate that into meaningful action? So my glass is also half full because we all care about our children and our grandchildren, and occasionally even think about things like great-grandchildren. I don't know, maybe some of you might be so lucky to be at that stage. But, you know, intergenerational equity is something that it's part of our values generally. But, you know, we make decisions, you know, in a really short time frame. Like usually, you know, what am I going to do 15 minutes from now? And so, again, tapping into these deeper currents and feelings that are part of our nature, we just have not been successful in doing that. And the final 2 points I want to make about why I think the glass is half full, and this is part of why I hope that we can translate some of these ideas into action, is that we have to be able to enunciate the truth that environmental protection is not a zero-sum game with economic growth. That is another lie. It is not true. I will give you one piece of evidence to support my thesis. The Endangered Species Act was passed in 1973, a compilation of gross domestic product. From 1973 to 2000, it grew from 1.3 trillion to 14 trillion. The average income grew from 6,000 to 46,000. You can find all the statistics you want. We had an incredible overall period, 1970, 1980, 1990, 2000, until 2008. It was a period of serious economic prosperity for a mature economy. You know, we're not China, we're not going to do 7 or 8, 9%. But a mature economy continued to grow after this deluge of environmental protection. It's not a zero-sum game, but it is framed that way. Jobs in the environment, jobs in the environment, jobs in the environment. And it just isn't a lot of broad research data to support that proposition. But it's one that you hear time and time again. And that debate has to be changed. Christine Todd Whitman, the former head of EPA, has written some very persuasive articles on the subject, talking about how, you know, if anything, the opposite is true. That economies can grow with environmental protection. That, you know, we can have our cake and eat it too, but that is not a message that resonates in today's world, and so it's framed as a zero-sum game, and it shouldn't be. And finally, the last point I want to make, why I think the glass is half full, is that we are not, by you being here, you are not disengaging, and we cannot disengage. We cannot disengage. I had some slides, but I only had a handful and decided it wasn't worth bringing a projector for. But one of them, or two of them, are of the San Fernando Valley. 1920s. Bucolic fields, meandering streams, a few houses here and there, farmland, beautiful. 2000, wall to wall, suburban. And we can't be so naive to think that that can't happen here. You know, this isn't going to look like the San Fernando Valley. We don't have Los Angeles sitting at our doorstep. But you know what's happening out in this valley, those of you who've been here 20, 30, 40 years. It's changing. If the climate projections are true in 2050, you are going to see a lot of climate refugees. People coming from Arizona, Texas. You know, it's going to be like Saudi Arabia down there. People aren't going to want Florida. You know, we're going to get climate refugees, and population is going to swell. There's no zoning. The other photo is a photo of the Bitterroot Valley overlain by the Montana cadastral that shows the subdivision extension. You know, the valley's been subdivided, there's no zoning. Don't pretend that what happened in California can't happen here. If we stay engaged, it may not happen. We have to stay engaged. And part of that, and this is my last glass half full, you know, the courts are a co-equal branch of government. And our founding people had the wisdom to see we needed to have an independent judiciary that had power, that had teeth, that's part of what creates a functioning democracy. And we have to quit vilifying people that use the courts, and we have to quit vilifying lawyers. I've been called a serial litigator. Me and Charles Manson. But seriously, you know, we need to be proud of our court system, and we can't be afraid to use it. And it has worked. I mean, it backrolled the Reagan era of environmental rollbacks. It put us down to it. And even in this day and age, you know, our judiciary does important things. I'm not just talking about environmental protection, that's what I know about, but courts have an important role. We need to support that, we need to embrace that, and to recognize that it's part of our democracy, and not let people vilify those that use the courts. So, you know, I think the glass is half full, and so does my hero, E.O. Wilson. He ends this, this fairly terrifying book called The Social Conquest of Earth. If you haven't read it, it's a fascinating read. With a positive note, saying that the 22nd century, not the 21st, it's going to be ugly, but the 22nd century can mark the ultimate flowering of humanity, because, you know, we do have brains. We're genetically predisposed to kill each other and consume things, and it goes on, explains it genetically. But then he says, but we do have brains, and we can do things differently. So he ends positively. He's set up foundations. He's, you know, I don't know, he's in 80s or 90s. He's establishing national parks in Africa. He's not letting up. And Martin Rees has started an institute in Cambridge to study threats to humanity. And you can find that on the website. It's fascinating. They're taking a serious look at this stuff. Saying, okay, you know, if we're going to be able to have school kids creating, you know, life in 50 years out of a science kit, because that's how high our technology is going to be, well, we can get ahead of the curve. We can understand it. And, you know, for me, I have the privilege of working with all of you and of using our court system, and of seeing firsthand that organizations and people can make a difference. And it's not just in the court system, it's in the communities, you know, it's out on the rivers. It's doing things to promote and protect the environment. So I hope your glass is half full, and thank you for listening tonight. So you know, I guess I'd take a few questions if anyone has any, or comments.
Just one way to follow on. A lot of times we hear about frivolous lawsuits, and maybe just ask you to comment, you know, with regards to what, from your perspective, you stress the importance, you know, of the courts there, but from your perspective, you know, what would you feel, you know, if citizens are to use the courts, how do we keep from, you know, being frivolous?
Well, the rules of procedure that we operate under have a pretty good safeguard for that, and it's called Rule 11. And if your lawsuit is frivolous, and meaning that it's not grounded in law and fact, then your client, which would be you guys, and or the lawyer, can be assessed sanctions and attorney fees. And that's the definition of a frivolous lawsuit. Because it's a novel lawsuit, that doesn't make it frivolous. Because it's controversial, that doesn't make it frivolous. But there's a safeguard built in the system, and I believe that guards.
Jack, do you see on a national level any particular campaign or organization or individual who's really tapping into the opportunities that you laid out with your glass half full that are could maybe be a role model for us on a local level or for other people or organizations? Some campaign or someone who's doing it right.
Well, I think the Citizens Climate Lobby is one organization that has taken a very strong nonpartisan approach to trying to get legislation through Congress in spite of the obstacles and have grown rapidly and garnered a lot of support. And they're very grassroots oriented, they're absolutely nonpartisan, and they're very sort of process oriented in that they involve people. And they involve individuals, regular people, going to Washington, D.C. and just demanding to talk one-on-one and then educating them to have the talking points to go talk to the people that make their laws in a very respectful and rational and nonpartisan way. And I think that that's one that comes to mind.
I think one advantage we have with the climate issue is that, as you mentioned in your talk, is that the military completely is behind it in admitting that it exists and in coming up with contingency plans, and I don't think we're tapping enough into that. The military's support of the existence of climate change, because that cuts across political parties and could be a wedge too among Republicans.
Yeah, no, and I recently read something, and I can't give you a source, but one branch of the military said it is the greatest threat to national security in the long term. The greatest threat. And that's coming from people who live and breathe threats to national security. So I think you're right. I agree with that. Yes?
A couple of days ago, on a bill, an amendment, the United States Senators were asked to vote up or down on whether they believed in climate change. 49 United States Senators said they did not believe that there was climate change, nor that it was man-caused, including ours. Do you see any half glass full in that?
No, I don't. I mean, there's no doubt that taking an aggressive stand on climate change is not scoring political points. I agree with that.
In the introduction, I think I heard that there are 2 active lawsuits local here. I'm new to the area.
Okay.
Can you provide a thumbnail description of those issues?
Yeah, I can. I mean, there are actually 3 that have been filed. One is challenging the Legacy Ranch subdivision, the largest subdivision I think ever in western Montana. That has a complicated history that I won't go into, but it's challenging the approval of this subdivision without adequate consideration of a whole host of environmental issues. The second is for the Grantsdale subdivision, a challenge to the water quality permit that was issued without taking into account potential additional nutrient pollution to the Bitterroot River. And the third is to challenge a permit for an unspecified store on Blood Lane, that also on groundwater issues, and also for not having any public process on what's the thing is really all about. So those are the 3 in Ravalli County.
Jack, the thing that's kind of a glass half full regarding, the legislators who support climate change, or don't believe in it. Our president just directly addressed that in the State of the Union when he kind of scoffed at them and said, I've heard it said many times, I'm not, referring to other people saying this, I'm not a scientist. And then he tried to wiggle off the hook, and he pointed out that he has access to scientists, as do they. So, it was being directly addressed. Our president was having the courage to stand up.
Yeah, and I would contrast that to the comment that the gentleman over here just made about, the senators not being willing to do that. And I do give Obama, I give him pretty high marks for being willing to put it out, knowing that it's politically unpopular, at least in some circles, but he also has access not only to scientists, but to the same polling data that says 70% of Americans favor regulation. And so there are ways to tap into that. Yes?
Right now in our legislature, there's at least 3 bills that have to do with transferring federal lands to state control. Do you have any comments on that?
It's silly. Or let me use another word, moronic. And also unconstitutional, at least by the state can't do it. And Utah has some suit but it's way out in left field. It really is. So yeah, and I think it's incredibly short-sighted. I think one of the greatest legacies. I teach natural resource law, and I lectured on it in other countries. And I get up and I am waving the flag, and I am saying one of the greatest things this country has, is several hundred million acres of land that every one of you can walk out on and enjoy and have a say in the management. And I think it's one of the greatest things that America has created, beginning with the first national park. And these people who want to turn it over to state management, the states can't afford to manage it. The states will sell it off, or they'll just exploit it. I mean, it's a bad idea, and I don't think it's one that'll come to pass.
Couple things. I think that a lot of the issue is a cultural thing. I hate to say it, but a cultural difference. A culture, you're really shadow boxing in a culture war, where both sides don't understand the other culture and don't pay attention to the other culture. Because, when I was working on forestry issues, I could sit down with almost anybody who's logged in this forest, and we had so much in common. Okay? We had a lot in common. We could sit and talk about why being honest about what the environmentalist impact on logging, but also be honest about the business end of it and why it didn't make any sense to turn round logs on the square boards. You can always have that conversation one-on-one if you choose to do it. And to me, if you just litigate and you don't try to deal with the political, shifting the political, paying attention to the culture, talking to people with respect from their viewpoint, then all you're doing is putting a Band-Aid on it. To me, you always got to do them together. And when I was involved in Friends of the Bitterroot, all of our successes that I was involved in were always doing both at the same time. And that takes an organized group of people that are working on talking to the people that disagree with you, listening to them, suing at the same time, and explaining your position in the press. And to me, if you're not doing all those things, in the long run, you're just going to go back.
No, I couldn't agree more, and that's why environmental lawyers are ranked at the bottom of the public opinion polls. And yeah, don't get me wrong, I do believe that there is a fundamental role for courts in our society, and the people that disparage that, I don't have any patience with. But people that want to truly be serial litigators and sue over every timber sale, every subdivision, every bad thing that happens, that it just backfires. You're right. So I agree with what you said.
About the used car sales. So another interesting read, since you're talking about money, and is the Beast from Jekyll Island, which is off the Georgia coast, the creation of the Federal Reserve.
Okay, what's it called?
The Beast.
The Beast of
from
Jekyll Island. Okay. Put it on my list.
Just a comment, sort of a curmudgeonly view of the glass half full is, in my experience, when there's natural disasters and the environment kicks our ass, it often brings out the best in the community. I saw it here in 2000 fires, where even I was aided and helped by, neighbors who really hate my environmental views, but people saw this force of nature down. A hurricane in Baja, same thing, where people are stranded and everybody's, you know, sharing the last half, cutting the last sandwich in half and sharing it. I think that climate change is going to kick our butts, and we need some humility, and we're going to get a big dose of humility where it'll be clear that the environment isn't just an aesthetic. It's like the foundation. So I really think that what's going to bring the masses of people around will not be, you know, convincing speeches or arguments or anything else. It'll be nature kicking our ass until we get some humility. And climate change is just the thing to do it.
And it is.
Is there any estimate of, I'm sorry,
No, go ahead.
of how many businesses went out of business due to the 2000 fires?
I would,
Does anybody know?
I don't know that.
Jack, why do you think Friends of the Bitterroot, and I guess Bitterroots for Planning too, often get vilified here in the valley, even by mainstream conservation groups?
Well,
Or what could we be doing better?
Yeah, I do not claim to be an observer of Ravalli County politics. So I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer that question, but certainly the currents that I talked about, the forces behind anti-environmentalism, that it's a zero-sum game, that an absolute belief in private property and free markets, and environmentalism works against that. I know that is a prevalent way of thinking among a certain percentage of the population.
Do you think that ideology or that mentality has done a good job in dividing and conquering environmental interests here in the valley? And
boy, that's a really good point, and that's a whole nother subject. Is divisions within the environmental community, and how paralyzing that can be, and how easily that's exploited. Yeah, I think that's a good point. All right, well, one more question, and then let's call it a night.
Well, I guess I'll go back to somewhat of a legal question, or a consideration. In terms, when it is, we are at a point when the courts are really, the only recourse left to John and Jane Doe to pursue, justice regarding, an environmental issue like water pollution or, other public safety, impacts that are not mitigated by a subdivision approval and those types of things. I guess could you comment a little bit on what citizens and whether they're individual citizens acting on their own to bring their concerns into the process for consideration? Maybe share a little bit with what is important to get incorporated into the decision-making process, whether it's at a hearing level of a state agency, or local government. Could you maybe speak to the importance of establishing a public record, that hopefully informs decision makers to make good, wise, and balanced decisions, but if indeed, standing in the preponderance of the evidence, they make a decision that is not in the public's interest. I don't know if you could share a little bit of what to maybe make citizens more effective, and rather than coming up and saying, look, this is just a bad idea, and you really, we don't want you to do it.
Yeah, I wish I had that formula, but I don't. But I can say, two things. One is that, I think you have to view lawsuits as a backstop and a means to spark a public debate. Like I said, and that I think ties into a little bit what Jim said, is that it's, we need to have courts as a backstop. At some point, governments cross the line, and in our country, and in damn few other countries worldwide, but in our country, a court can say, you're breaking the law, county commissioners, governor, president, you are breaking the law, and you gotta stop. And that's important. But if it's in environmental, if it's not a catalyst to education and public discourse and solving problems, then ultimately you're spinning your wheels, because many of the, we get a subdivision overturned because they did a bad EA. Well, they'll go back and do another EA. I mean, you just get on a treadmill here, and that's not the answer. So if it's a means to inform the public debate, and at the same time send government a message. I mean, frankly, I'll use the Forest Service as an example. I think the Forest Service has learned an enormous amount of positive, my friends there wouldn't couch it this way, but from all the litigation, which they hated and which hurt them, but boy, they do a much better job. They're much more inclusive. And it took a long time, but it also took a bunch of courts saying, you are breaking the law, you are breaking, and I frankly think the era of suing over timber sales should be over, and we got to move on into something else. That the Forest Service does a much better job by and large, and I think that's sort of a positive outcome of a long litigation campaign. And I know that some of the county governments do a much better job. After having been to court and lost and invested the resources, and they make better decisions.
Could be DDP.
Not going to happen. Keep the glass half full. Thank you all very much.
I'd like to announce, it's a little bit late, but there